Stefan over there, hello. Welcome. And welcome everyone. So I suppose we can start, right? Okay. So it's my pleasure to host this session in conversation with Stefan Wolff from the University of Birmingham, but who is actually in Georgia at the moment, in Tbilisi, right? Right. So welcome to everyone to this conference. We are here in presence at the Universidade Autónoma de Lisboa and at the 10th International Conference on International Studies, which is co-organized as well with CESRAN and other partners. Stefan, before we move to Russia-Ukraine war, which is the topic of this in-conversation, the very hot topic, I would like, if you please, you to tell us a bit about yourself, about your life experiences, ambitions, so that we can understand what led you to become a leading researcher and teacher on international relations. And I have to say that I had the pleasure on my way to Lisbon this morning to read your very recent article of yesterday in the conversation, where you give us a very in-depth analysis of the elections in the recognized territories by Russia and the perspective on the long war. But as I said, before we move to such pressing and critical issues, I would like you please to tell us a bit more about what led you to the moment we are here today and the pleasure of having you here.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I should say the pleasure is all mine, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity. Also, I have to say I'm a little bit intimidated because I'm the second Birmingham speaker today, so I now have the almost impossible act of following in the footsteps of my good friend and colleague Nick Wheeler, who gave a lecture earlier today. So how did I get here? Well, I mean, where do I start? Obviously, we don't have that much time, so I won't give you my entire life story, but maybe suffice to say that I grew up in East Germany. Part of what brought me to studying the post-Soviet space is also that I partly grew up, in a sense, in that space. I still do speak some Russian. I understand and read it quite well. So I also have access to a part of the discourse on the region that is not necessarily always so easily accessible to everybody. My own sort of scholarly career really started with an interest in ethnic conflict. And as you can see from my, I dare not even say gray beard, it's a pretty much white beard by now. Sort of I started dealing with this in the early 1990s when sort of ethnic conflict made a major return, both to the real world, but also to scholarship. But I didn't at the time really study conflicts in the post-Soviet space, but I looked at Northern Ireland, and at the time I did my PhD, that was the time when the Good Friday Agreement actually came to pass in 1998. But then gradually I sort of, well, you could say I discovered my roots in the East. So I started working much more on what was at the time called the frozen conflicts in Eastern Europe, in the OSCE region, whichever way you want to define it. And the sort of my first political consultancy engagement dates back almost exactly 20 years to when I was asked by the then Moldovan government in 2003 to give my opinion on the so-called Cossack memorandum that was making the rounds then. And that sort of provided both an interesting entry point, but also then never really let me go. And then over the years since then, we obviously have had several major crises in the region that increasingly also acquired this sort of geopolitical dimension. So apart from still having an interest in the actual dynamics of the conflicts on the ground, I also expanded, if you want, my profile into sort of geopolitics, geopolitical rivalries, great power politics. Again, I mean, there are lots and lots of different names for it, but essentially it is, in a way, an interest in the role that actors like Russia, the collective West, but increasingly also China and other regional powers like Turkey, to some extent also Iran, now play in the region. And then obviously we had the tragic events in February 2022 that led to the war in Ukraine, Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Well, and that's where we are now. So I hope that gives you some background. Maybe not enough, but I was also told definitely don't make it longer than 5 minutes. So here we are.
Thank you, Stefan. Yes, it's actually very important to know where you come from, because where you stand will be where you sit in this conversation. So it's also already enlightening to understand your path. And actually, your interest in the world, and you mentioned the collective West and regional powers and China. And I would like to start with a question on Russia. In the context, of course, of the war, and a question, maybe a very broad question on the long-term relationship between Russia and the West. Because when we ask the why question, we sense it's not really important anymore to understand why we have come here. We need to understand how and how far we will be able to resume a form of dialogue with Russia, if any. So, in other words, I would like to ask you, what does the eruption of the war and the long war perspective that actually you really touched upon very well in your yesterday's article? I really like this take, and maybe the audience didn't read it, so it would be nice to talk about it. So what does this tell us about the political organization of Europe and the long-term relationship with Russia?
Right. I think there are a number of really important aspects here. Let me start with a slight caveat at the beginning. I mean, everybody who has sort of followed the debates knows how very controversial, how very contested, how very unresolved these debates really are. And I do not claim to have any kind of ultimate answers here. I absolutely accept that a lot of people will not agree with my analysis, in the same way that I won't agree with necessarily everybody else's analysis in this. For me, one of the most important points is that from a sort of scholarly perspective, what we need to avoid, I think, is what you could describe as hindsight bias, where sort of we make events fit a particular narrative that we agree with, or that we sort of want to, or that people want to push in order to not just explain the situation as it is now, but also to sort of project into the future and then arrive at certain policy recommendations, prescriptions of what should be done in the future. I think what's very clear from my perspective is no matter how we got there, no matter who is to blame, I think one of the very few points of agreement that we have is that the existing security order in Europe, as we knew it until February 2022, that is, I would say, irretrievably a matter of the past. That's gone, that's destroyed, that is highly unlikely to be resurrected in any shape or form, any time in the near future. So that in itself, however, should not be mistaken as saying that that was necessarily a wrong order or a bad order, or that whatever will replace it will not in some ways look similar to what we had. Maybe not similar to what we had in 2015, but maybe similar to what we had in 1985. Or I'm sort of a big believer in the OSCE. Probably not many of my kind around, but I think there remains a value in having channels of communication, in having some platform arena for dialogue with Russia. So again, I mean, I'm not making any excuses here for Russia's illegal invasion, the war of aggression. I mean, from my point of view, that was a war of choice by Russia. Russia, therefore, cannot really deflect blame onto anyone or anything else. But by the same token, I have to say I'm not unsympathetic to the French view that, well, Russia is not going to go away. I mean, Russia is going to remain a part in Europe. Russia is going to remain a neighbor to the European Union, to NATO. So in some way, any future European and indeed global security order will need to account for Russia, for the Russia that is today, for the Russia that will be in the future, but also sort of will have to account for how relationships with Russia have developed, not just since 1991, but also sort of I think it's important here to reflect on certain lessons from the Cold War and how very difficult periods in the Cold War were managed between the great powers, between the superpowers, between the Soviet bloc and the West. I think what certainly has changed since then is that China is a much more important player globally, for sure. But also, if you look at Chinese actions in relation to the war in Ukraine. So I don't want to go into the extent to which Russia agrees with China, to which extent China agrees with Russia, sort of who is the junior partner in the relationship. But all of that, I think, is sort of part of a bigger picture where China will become, from my point of view, inevitably a player in this future European security order as well. And if you look at China's position on the what they call the crisis in Ukraine, I mean, that's interesting in many different ways, and there are a lot of interesting nuances to it. But for me, when Russia published this policy paper on the eve of the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, that really was putting down a stake, putting down a claim in being a major player in a future European security order, which from a Chinese perspective, obviously is a Eurasian or a Euro-Asian security order, not so much a Euro-Atlantic security order. So I think all of those dimensions come together here. And I think we need to think about Russia and where Russia's place in this order will be. But we also have to think beyond Russia and confront the new broader geopolitical realities that I think were in the making already before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but I think they certainly have been accelerated by the events that unfolded from February 2022 onwards.
Thank you, Stefan. I would like to hear you about more about some references that you just made to think what will be the relationship with Russia. Of course, we understand that in a world of multiple crises and the enlargement of players outside of Europe, the game is bigger, is Eurasian. But still, for the Europeans, as you mentioned, the French position, Russia will not move away. Geography is there. It has a border with Europe. It's in Europe, partially. And you refer 1985 as well, 1991, and the Cold War reference to understand what we can do in the relationship with Russia and if we can do something. And I would like to be a bit provocative, quoting Churchill, who is always very much quoted. So going back to the end of the Second World War, when it was not clear how far the Red Army would move into Central Europe. And Churchill said to Eisenhower, and I will quote him, "I deem it highly important that we should shake hands with the Russians as far to the east as possible." So the understanding, I don't know if you agree with this, but this is the idea that there should be a buffer between us and Russia. And what does this mean for Ukraine if we have this understanding of shaking hands with the Russians as far as possible to the east, even if in this new geopolitical balance, of course, it's not the same as the Cold War. China has a different role here. So I would like to hear you a bit more about if you would agree with this Churchill understanding.
Well, I think it's, I mean, yes and no. I think that's sort of a good balanced answer to that. I mean, there are certain continuities, obviously, between sort of 1945 and let's say 2020, 2023. But there are also important differences. So I think what is definitely clear is that Russia, as much as the Soviet Union at the time, is very much sort of a power that is certainly anti-liberal. So in that sense, I think there are important ideological continuities. There's also a continuity in the sense that much like the Soviet Union at the time, through structures like the Communist International, for example, tried to sort of push this anti-liberal narrative. Now, obviously, at the time of Stalin, the Soviet Union, his successors, and so on and so forth, I mean, that was very much sort of a communist ideological narrative. I think now, with Putin, he is much less selective. Basically, anything anti-liberal from a Russian perspective, as I understand it, are useful allies. So what therefore then is a key difference in relation to sort of the time when Churchill made his statements. As far east as possible has a very different meaning in a world today where sort of boundaries, distances, I think have a different meaning. So yes, obviously, I mean, from an international law perspective, I mean, Russia's boundaries should not be allowed to move west as a result of its war of aggression against Ukraine. So in that sense, absolutely not. So, I mean, if we ever were to shake hands with the Russians again, then at the borders as they were back before Russia actually started its war against Ukraine in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and the illegal occupation of parts of Donbass. Then, but we also have to be aware of that. I mean, the way of Russian warfare, I think, is a very different one. So yes, it is conventional to some extent, but it also includes, as a matter of doctrinal course, all kinds of hybrid elements. There's a lot of cyber threats going on. So in that sense, I think physical borders and boundaries have a different meaning. And if we were to translate sort of Churchill's quote that you gave us into the realities of the 21st century, we couldn't just think of it in terms of geographical east. We would also need to think of it as a space where Russia in many ways has deeply penetrated into the Western liberal space, whether that's through questionable alliances with, say, Viktor Orban in Hungary, with Marine Le Pen in France. Who knows what's going to happen in the next presidential elections and in the campaign run-up to 2024. So I think there are lots of different dimensions in terms of what you might generally think of a containment policy of Russia, of a policy of deterrence vis-a-vis Russia, that certainly was not something that people like Churchill or George Kennan, the US ambassador to Moscow at the time, were thinking about. But I think we really need to make these concepts fit for the 21st century.
as you are explaining these dimensions and your point of view, I would like to cite this moment of the conversation exactly to ask you a question related to the operational dimension of this war. You already mentioned that we are way beyond a conventional war. There is a conventional dimension and unconventional. There are also new weapons being used, the drones. What do you think about how much the battlefield determines the political outfalls of the war? And in a context when the Ukrainian counteroffensive of this summer we are told that it's failing. There is a lot of public communication on both sides about if it is failing or not failing. How do you see the specificities of the operational dimension having an impact on the questions that we have already discussed, which is the future of Ukraine, the new arrangements with Russia, the place of China? How do you see this, the battlefield as a key dimension of the moment we are living?
Well, let me caveat that first of all by saying that I have a political take on the battlefield, not necessarily sort of a military. I'm not a military scientist in that sense. I mean, what I would say is definitely that the military outcomes will have a significant impact also on the future of the European security order, both in the sense of what will actually be, in the end, the settlement of this war, but also in a way, what will we have learned or what will we think that we have learned about Russian behavior in the future and how it can be effectively channeled in ways that would as much as possible deter a repeat of what we have seen in I mean, not just 2022 in Ukraine. I mean, that is sort of the I think the worst of it. But I mean, you could go all the way back to Georgia in 2008, for example, Ukraine 2014 again. So I think in that sense, it is very important to sort of bear in mind that there is clearly a military factor in the way in which the future will be shaped in a more political sense. However, I also think that, I mean, to talk now about the failure of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, you know, on the one hand, I would say it's a bit too early because, I mean, even in the worst case scenario, there's probably still 4 weeks of good weather left for fighting. Then, depending on where you look on the ground, actually, the bad weather that might be happening sort of over the autumn will actually have very different impacts on different parts of a front line that is almost 1,000 kilometers long. So some of the assessments that I have seen and also had an opportunity to discuss with military experts are rather that in the south, actually, fighting can continue even through the bad weather period. And so I think from that perspective, it's probably too early to tell. Clearly, what is not happening is a similar stunning success, if you want, as we had seen last year in the autumn when Ukraine retook significant territories from Russia, both in the east and in the south. So again, from that perspective, I think the military outcome is undecided yet. But what is also important is I think that the discussions will pick up over the next few months, actually about who was at fault or what were the causes of whatever the outcome will be in the end. And again, I think this is a very, it is already a complex and complicated discussion. So is it Ukrainian tactics? Is it the amount of military gear that the West has supplied to Ukraine? Is it the strength of the Russian defense? Again, I think this is a constant learning process that everybody is going through here. And I think for me the most important element of this is to make sure that we actually draw the right lessons of the options that emerge as the situation on the battlefield either changes. So how long will it be possible to sustain a war of attrition? In the end, will just the sheer mass of humans that Russia can throw into this war make a decisive difference. So again, I think there are lots of questions that we simply don't have the answer to right now, and I think it's dangerous if we get carried away by speculation that doesn't consider the different scenarios which could still develop here.
Yes, Stefan, sure, thank you. And you just mentioned the Russian strengths and the question mark on the Russian threats, which is, of course, a very important side of the hurdle. If you want to question how long we'll continue the conventional war, at least, but also the unconventional one. And regarding the Russian threats, I would like to hear you if you agree, because this is a matter of huge expectations, but also controversy, which is sanctioning Russia. Because sanctioning Russia. Since the war started, and before the war started, actually the sanctions were already applied to Russia because of the annexation of Crimea. There are a lot of studies. Russia has its own narrative on this. Are they effective? Are they not? Will they help stop the Russian capacity of fighting? We know that today, arguably, Putin is meeting the North Korean leader to help on the battlefield with probably ammunitions. So what do you think? Should we continue sanctioning Russia? Is it counterproductive? Is it affecting enough? Should we be patient regarding sanctions, waiting for the 10 years that the literature, academic literature always talk about 10 years for a delay to have real effect of sanctions? Then we have a lot of critics. It affects population, but we don't see the Russian population changing minds and being more concerned with the war because of the sanctions. So how do you see it, sanctions-wise?
Well, all of it, basically everything that you have said, I think makes a lot of sense. And I think taken together, it will probably give us answers. I think the sanctions, I mean, to some extent, they are working. I mean, we do see that Russia has certain shortages in terms of military equipment. I mean, certainly the reasonably effective so far sanctions on sort of denying Russia access to certain technology and parts in particular has an effect. But it certainly has not meant that the Russian war effort has crumbled. You mentioned North Korea, and again, I think that's partly a sign of the effectiveness of the sanctions. I mean, it's not like one would necessarily want to be voluntarily seen in the company of North Korea, or having to rely on Iran to potentially produce drones or deliver other military equipment to Russia. So I think in that sense, I mean, it's effective in one way, but it hasn't completely denied Russia access to the very resources that it needs to fight this war. Now, part of that, I think, also then is there's a flip side of that that has to do with the on the one hand that there are still enough willing customers for Russia, both in the sense of supplies, or what we have seen in a couple of countries in Central Asia and the South Caucasus, for example, re-export of goods to Russia. Then also, I mean, countries like India and China have massively profited from Russia's need to find new markets for its hydrocarbon exports. And then you could go one step further and say, well, I mean, in a way, the fact that Russia and Saudi Arabia, for example, now drive pricing through the OPEC cartel of oil and gas also means that actually Russia has to sell less in order to still actually replenish its foreign currency reserves. So again, I mean, it's a very complex picture. But the one thing that we also mustn't forget is that I mean, sanctions is a way of sending an important message, namely that Russian actions simply cannot be tolerated. They are completely illegal under international law at the start of the invasion, but increasingly also we find more and more evidence that it's completely illegal under international. Targeting of specific individuals again is very important and potentially can have long-term impacts here. Even though if you look at, for example, all these so-called smart sanctions against Russian oligarchs and of Putin, it has not led to the kind of internal upheaval, with the exception of Prigozhin's mutiny. Again, I mean, that was not sanctions related, I think. So it hasn't had those effects yet that one might have hoped for a year ago.
Yes, Stefan, thank you. And thank you for also underlying the signaling function of sanctions, like indicating that what is a non-admissible behavior, some kind of normative organization of world politics. And however, I would say that, and if we look again at the most recent events, such as, for instance, the gathering of the G20 a few days ago, and Russia and China were not there. And what we have witnessed since the war started is the emergence of what many call a global south, which should be an alternative to the construction, normative construction as well, since the Second World War of the world. And the G20 somehow indicated that Russia was not that isolated. So sanctions meant to isolate Russia and also to signal that it was not a right behavior. But at the same time, we understand that Russia is not that isolated. So the picture is a bit complicated. We see that countries like China, India, look first and foremost for their interests. So they will engage with Russia as long as it profits them. So my question would be, if we look at the real big picture, so all the countries involved in from the what we call the global south, how Russia plays with that and the other countries, is Russia really isolated? And the fact that it met North Korea, you mentioned right now that it would be not a good sign for Russia, aligning with North Korea, Iran to supply deficiencies in terms of the battlefield is not a good sign for Russia. But diplomatically, it has friends and allies, it seems at least. How do you see these connections today with Russia, which are quite complex and sometimes difficult to decipher?
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's there's no easy and certainly no short answer to that. I think in terms of the global south, I think there is not a lot that the countries in the global south have strategically in common, other than that they all see themselves as not benefiting fairly within the current international order. So this liberal order that I think is still certainly quite strong. Now we can debate forever and a day how accurate that actually is, who is to blame for it. So I think in a way Russia, but even more so China, have managed to create a narrative here that brings a lot of countries together that otherwise have relatively little in common. And I mean, what's interesting about the G20 is I mean, neither Russia nor China were present at the level of their presidents. I mean, they sent slightly lower placed officials. They still engaged, and they managed actually to bring about a declaration of the G20 that was certainly far less critical of Russia than what we had in the G20 declaration a year ago in Bali. Does that necessarily mean that everybody in the G20 who is not a G7 member agrees with Russia? I really don't think so. And if you look back a month ago, the BRICS meeting happened in South Africa. Very big event, expansion, new members. But a relatively small number of new members. And again, it doesn't massively increase the global economic weight of the BRICS. Yes, the addition of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates adds two major producers of oil and gas. So that is to some extent shifting the weight a little bit. But then, I mean, if you sort of think forward maybe 5 or 10 years, what is the future of the BRICS? I think that is still completely undecided. I mean, for China at the moment, it's one of many tools to organize the global south, to organize different alliances in sort of China's own geopolitical, geoeconomic interests. So at the moment, this is aligned to some extent with what Russia is trying to do in relation to the war in Ukraine, not to be completely isolated. But again, I think this is much more sort of, we need to look at this more from a Chinese perspective rather than from a Russian perspective. So I mean, Russia benefits from Chinese moves here to organize a China-led bloc in what I would see as an emerging new bipolar order. Russia is almost accidental here. And if you look at the future of the BRICS, for example, I mean, to what extent would other democratic countries actually want to join a bloc that basically is, well, a grouping of highly authoritarian countries? I mean, it's not like you would want to be in the company of Iran, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China on the global stage. Certainly not if you have a real interest in the further development of democracy as a form of government. So yes, I mean, the Chinese are talking a good game about there are many different phases of human rights and democracy, but personally, I would say the Russian and Chinese version of democracy and human rights, they do not gel with my slightly more traditional understanding of what these concepts should mean. So in that sense, I think the whole question of the global South, we shouldn't underestimate the resentment that is felt in many parts of the world about what is seemingly an order that first and foremost benefits the United States and its closest allies. But by the same token, I think we should not overestimate the extent to which this can actually be a major organizing principle along the lines that maybe China and Russia are envisaging at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for sharing your view on the world that is in the making, that is, in your view, bipolar in the perspective of the Chinese-American competition and overt competition. This is an important aspect to understand the war, the ongoing war. And I would seize this opportunity to ask you a question more specifically about the United States. The US is clearly leading the collective West and the support to Ukraine politically, but also in the material support to Ukraine. They are not the only supporters, but they are the leaders, clearly. But we have a possible change next year because of presidential elections. So 2024 can be a possible change, a deep change in the US presidency. And we are already seeing the campaign being organized, not the official campaign, but still. How do you see that this change in the leadership can impact the war, and also the consequences for Europe of this change in terms of the competition with China?
Right. Again, the caveat before I say anything, I'm not an expert in US politics, so I am not making any predictions about
But
who.
you know, former President Trump for sure. That is.
Of course, yeah. No. I mean, I will say something about that. I just don't want this to be taken as my prediction of who is going to win
Sure,
or not.
It's just a scenario if President
absolutely.
Biden is not there next year. Well, 2025 January.
No, yeah, you're absolutely right. I think it's difficult not to see that that would be a major problem, given everything that President Trump has said in the run-up so far, from his amazing ability to magically resolve the war in Ukraine within 24 hours of him taking office. To a lot of the noises that you also hear generally among some of the contenders for the Republican nomination, that sort of we should stop supporting Ukraine, we should make a deal with Russia. It's much more important to focus on the competition with China. The war with Russia is a distraction, and so on and so forth. And I mean, there's a degree of substance to these arguments for sure, and I would not necessarily disagree with some of the assessments in terms of what it actually means, just in terms of the attention span that people can devote to different areas of broader geopolitical and geoeconomic competitions. I mean, that's clearly, I mean, that's not the point. The point is here, how will a future US president deal with these challenges? And to what extent will the very strong anti-China sentiment that you have in, I mean, across the political spectrum in the United States, to what extent will that drive to borrow a phrase from a former President Obama, to what extent will the US be able to have strategic patience in relation to the situation with Russia? So to what extent will there be a continued commitment to supporting Ukraine? And at what level will this commitment happen? Now, again, I'm not a sort of expert in military matters, but it seems to me that a lot of the support that has come from the West so far has prevented Ukraine from losing. It has prevented Putin from winning. But I don't think we have quite yet seen the game-changing support that would actually enable Ukraine to win. And again, if there was a Trump presidency, I would definitely not see a move into that direction. But I'm also not sure that sort of collectively the wisdom of the sort of United States defense and foreign policy establishment would be completely discarded, and we would, as the West, collectively give up on Ukraine and basically force them by stopping support to make a very unfavorable deal with Russia and all the consequences that that would have. Certainly, what I don't see would be possible is for Europe, for the EU, the UK, European part of NATO, to manage the level of support that currently exists, both the actual support for Ukraine, but also the upholding of the sanctions regime against Russia to be possible without continuing US leadership. So I think from that perspective, the presidential elections in 2024 will be potentially a major watershed in this relation. But again, I think we need to be careful not to overestimate how the sort of dynamics in general will develop with or without a Trump presidency.
Thank you very much, Stefan. I have many more questions to you, but we just have roughly 15 minutes before the session ends. So I would like to open the discussion to the audience. And while answering the question, if I may, Stefan, I would like you, if possible, also you to tell us, because as I said, you are a leading researcher and you have also a quite important mediatic presence about the war, so that you tell us a bit also about what you are working on at present, because it's interesting for us, and here we have a lot of researchers as well at the conference mainly, and what do you plan in the near future. So I would like to hear about your plans too, because we are all very much interested in what is on the edge of, of research concerning Stefan Wolff's engagement. So I will open to the audience. I don't know if you have questions online, but I cannot read anything from here. It's too small, but maybe the organizers will help with that. So here a question, please present yourself, your name and institution, so that Stefan can know who is talking.
Hello, thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Stephen. My name is Victor Fernandes. I'm assistant professor at the Universidade de Lusíada here in Lisbon. I have 2 questions and 2 comments, if I may.
I'm sorry, just questions. We have 10 minutes before.
Okay, 4 questions then.
Sharp questions, please.
4 questions, okay. I'll transform it into questions.
As long as it's
okay,
sharp.
I will, Sandra, don't worry, please. You mentioned, let me go back to the start of the conversation. You mentioned I'm actually quite favorable to the French position. One of the things that we saw differently from past periods is Germany taking a very opposite position from France. So the sort of couple franco-français, French and Germany, sorry, did not work. I would like to hear your take on the German position, first of all. Secondly, I'd like to hear your view on secondary sanctions, insofar as legitimacy and efficiency or usefulness of those secondary sanctions. Thirdly, I'm sorry, I'm being pressured by Sandra. On the BRICS, you mentioned the durability of the relation within the BRICS, given the heterogeneity, lack of uniformity, if you will. But isn't that the point, that they all respect each other? They don't all have to be the same and very homogeneous, like we always think of ourselves in the West, which is not necessarily true either. And my last question is about bipolarity. You mentioned the word becoming bipolar. In fact, bipolarity, I think you're thinking in terms of influence and economic terms, but in fact, polarity is generally defined more in military terms. And there's still a huge gap in military terms between the US and the rest. So why not have a bipolar economic world, but still maintaining unipolarity in the world sense? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor. Stefan, can I take another question, or do you want to jump into?
Absolutely. I mean, the more questions you take, the more selective I can be in answering.
Okay, so I will collect at least one more question. Please try to be brief and straightforward. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Fernandes, Professor Wolff. Thank you for the fruitful discussion. First of all, my name is Dimitar Atanasov. I'm a master's student at Ishkte University here in Lisbon, and I have a quick question about Professor Wolff. So, do you see a Korean scenario for peace between Russia and Ukraine? And if you do you think that this will be just a preparation, a military preparation for another further escalation? Thank you.
Okay, Stefan, over to you now, please.
Okay, thank you. Well, I start with the last question because that's something that I've been thinking and occasionally writing about since the war started. I think the key question there is where's the equivalent of the, I think it's the 49th parallel. So where do we draw the line? And who will provide the security guarantees to the rest of Ukraine that will actually make that a stable ceasefire line? So I think it's still one of the scenarios. The problem is that we do have an issue here that we had something almost like that with the Minsk agreements in 2015. It just wasn't stable because neither side, and in particular Russia, did not respect the ceasefire. So on the Korean ceasefire line, you don't have the constant violations of ceasefire of the ceasefire that you have had after the Minsk II Accord in February 2015. I think it would be highly risky to agree to something like that again, and then that would probably mean a long-term giving up on Ukraine's at least de facto territorial integrity and sovereignty. So I wouldn't rule it out, but I clearly cannot see it to be the preferred outcome, either on the Ukrainian side or more generally among Ukraine's partners. Moving back from that question, to the very beginning, where and how do I see Germany? Well, I mean, it's the Zeitenwende speech by Scholz raised a lot of expectations, not all of which I think have been fulfilled. But I do think that Germany has moved away from what you could argue for a very long period of time used to be a Russia first sort of Eastern European foreign policy on the part of Germany. So I don't think that's anymore the case. We also have to bear in mind here that Germany is run by a rather diverse coalition government right now. So that also makes bureaucratic processes even more difficult and complex than they used to be. But I think Germany has moved quite a bit, and that has been very important in terms of also keeping Western consensus, both on supporting Ukraine actively and in keeping the sanctions regime intact. Where do I see the future of the BRICS and whether heterogeneity isn't sort of what brings them together? Absolutely, yes, I do agree with that, but that still will not make it a very stable arrangement, and therefore also not necessarily one where sort of countries will see their engagement with the BRICS not necessarily as a decision for or against China, for or against the US. So I think in that sense, it's, if anything, it will probably be one of those platforms, if you want, that countries will use as part of what certainly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union is called a multi-vector foreign policy, where probably in IR terms you would say you hedge a lot, you don't really bandwagon, but sort of you try to keep reasonably good relations with everybody. That doesn't mean that the BRICS will go away or that they will not be a forum, but they will be just a forum among many. I don't see them emerging as a major player here, simply because I mean, even if you look at India, I mean, India is playing or is keeping its irons in many different fires. So I think from that perspective, the BRICS will be an important forum to consider, but I don't see them emerging as the major anti-US bloc that is being led by China. Not least because, I mean, India-China rivalry is not fully resolved yet. I also don't see necessarily Russia forever wanting to be the junior partner of China in the relationship in the way in which it has emerged right now. I'm sure there were other questions, but I can now say I'm old enough that I don't need to remember everything that I don't write down, and I didn't write anything down. But do feel free to email me. I mean, anybody who also didn't have a chance to ask a question, email me and I'll try my best to respond.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for answering so many questions and different dimensions of the current war, the Russia-Ukraine war. We have like 2 minutes to finish, and I would like to seize the opportunity before we say bye-bye and see you soon, of course, and thank you for the email proposal. I would really like, because you mentioned many aspects that, and honestly, yes, it's an honest answer, we don't know yet. We are witnessing major changes, both in the system, both in alliances and in more complex international relations. And I would like to know, if possible, what are you working now on at the moment? What are your plans? What is really interesting you? So in these unanswered questions, because we don't have the answer yet, what are you working on to get the answers?
Right. As my colleague Nick Reeder will probably be able to tell you right now, I'm trying to survive being head of department at my institution. So that tells you something about the fact that a lot of my research is mostly aspirational at the moment, rather than actual. So the two things that I'm doing right now, I mean, for years I have had a real interest in the OSCE. Now, obviously, this has also changed ever so slightly in terms of how relevant that might be in the future. But the two projects that I'm working on right now, one is about the security needs of states and societies in the OSCE area as they have been affected by the war in Ukraine, but also as they continue to exist outside the war in Ukraine. So the OSCE is very much both paralyzed and consumed by the war in Ukraine, but a lot of the security issues that exist in the region predate the war in Ukraine. Some have emerged newly, some have been exacerbated. So in that sense, I'm interested in everything else outside the Ukraine war as well. So again, I mean, this sort of the interest in sort of, well, geopolitics, great power rivalry, where I think there's a lot more going on beyond the headlines of the Ukraine war. And what fascinates me in a way is sort of how this plays out in organizations like the OSCE. And then again, not closely related to it, but somehow related to it. I'm really interested in sort of the different dynamics of great power politics in some of the subregions of the OSCE. So, as I said earlier, I'm in Georgia right now, so that's the South Caucasus. And the South Caucasus as a land region is bordered by two maritime regions, the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And then if you move one further to the east, you have Central Asia, and if you move one further to the west, you have the Western Balkans. So it's sort of this string of sub-regions of the OSCE where I'm really interested in how sort of great power dynamics or something out there. So what's the future role of China, the role of Iran, the role of Turkey, as they sort of confront at least a temporary Russian retreat from these regions, but also where we see sort of different aspirations in the West to engage or re-engage with some of these regions. Then that a little bit certainly in the Central Asian context. So all I'm trying to say, I think, is that I read these days, and then occasionally I'm able to write 800 words about my thinking on some of these issues for the conversation. But that's about the extent to which I'm doing major research these days, given that I somehow talked myself into or allowed myself to be talked into taking on this very interesting position of being head of department. But watch this space. Give me 2 years to finish up on that, and I might be back with some longer pieces of insight that we can then all disagree about.
And we will be very happy after these 2 years that you come back to more writing and developing these ideas. Thank you so much for this generous time with us from Georgia. Thank you to all of you here in the room and into the virtual space, whatever you are. We wish you well there, and also heading the department for the still next 2 years. And I think I can ask for an applause from everyone here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Stefan Wolff, and to the organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And all the
Bye-bye.
best to you.
Thank you.
Hi everyone. Next, thank you, by the way, Stefan. I just about to forget. Thank you for the contribution and for your time.
Thank you.
And
Thank
I
you
hope
for
to
having
see you
me.
in the next conference in face to face.
Take care,
Okay.
everybody. Bye.
Thank you.